They were never meant to love each other. In a world where chains decided destiny and silence was survival, she made a choice that shattered her own heart. A choice between love and duty, between freedom of the soul and survival of the body. She buried her feelings deep, believing some sacrifices were final, until fate, cruel and patient, brought him back when she least expected it. This is not just a story of love lost, it is a story of restraint, endurance, and the moment destiny refused to stay silent. Before the story unfolds any further, take a moment to subscribe to History Unmasked, hit the bell icon, and stay with us until the very end. Because this is not a story that reveals its truth quickly, and the meaning of her choice will only become clear when everything has been laid bare. She was born into a world that did not ask her what she wanted. A world where duty was not taught but enforced, where survival depended not on dreams but on obedience, and where every breath was measured against expectation. And from the earliest age she learned that wanting too much was dangerous, that asking questions invited punishment, and that silence, when practiced carefully, could become a shield. She moved through her days with a calm that others mistook for acceptance, but inside her mind was sharp and awake, constantly observing, learning when to lower her eyes and when to stand perfectly still, understanding that her value in this world was defined not by who she was, but by how well she fulfilled the role assigned to her. And yet even within those rigid boundaries there were moments, small, fragile moments, when the world seemed to hesitate, when something almost human flickered through the cracks of routine. And it was in one of those moments that love found her, quietly and without permission. He did not approach her with promises or declarations, because such things would have been reckless, and he did not speak to her as one speaks to someone to be owned, because something in him resisted that language instinctively. Instead, their connection formed in the pauses between tasks, in brief exchanges of understanding when words were unnecessary, in shared awareness of danger and restraint, and she felt it long before she allowed herself to name it, that subtle pull towards someone who saw her not as a function but as a presence, someone who listened when she spoke softly and noticed when she did not speak at all. And that recognition unsettled her more than cruelty ever had, because cruelty was familiar, predictable, something she had learned to endure. But kindness, especially the kind that asked for nothing in return, was destabilizing, and she understood immediately that whatever this feeling was, it could not be allowed to grow unchecked. She reminded herself daily of the rules she lived by, rules written not on paper but into flesh and memory. Do not hope, do not trust, do not imagine a future that does not include obedience, and above all do not love, because love demanded choices, and choices were a privilege she had never been granted. Still, the heart does not consult logic before it begins its work, and she found herself listening for his footsteps, noting the rhythm of his presence, feeling an unfamiliar warmth when he was near and a hollow absence when he was gone. And each time she caught herself in these thoughts, she disciplined them harshly, pushing them down with the same force she used to suppress fear, because she knew that even the smallest mistake could cost more than just her own safety. She had seen what happened to those who let emotion guide them, had witnessed lives unravel for far less, and she understood with painful clarity that loving him would not only endanger her but could destroy him as well, because the world they inhabited did not forgive such transgressions, did not romanticize sacrifice, and did not allow happy endings to grow in secret. Yet despite all this knowledge, despite her resolve, there were moments when the future pressed itself against her imagination uninvited, moments when she wondered, not what life with him would look like, but what it would feel like to choose something simply because her heart demanded it. And that question haunted her, because it revealed how deeply she had already fallen. She became more careful then, more controlled, her demeanor sharpening into something almost unapproachable, and others noticed her discipline, praised her reliability, unaware that this newfound restraint was born from fear rather than virtue, fear that if she allowed herself even one honest gesture, one unguarded look, everything she had built to survive would collapse. He noticed the change too, sensed the distance growing where closeness had once lived, and though he did not confront her directly, there was a quiet confusion in his eyes that cut her deeper than accusation ever could, because she could not explain without unraveling everything. Nights became the hardest, when exhaustion loosened her control and memory replayed moments she had tried to erase. The sound of his voice lowered in respect rather than command. The way he waited for her response instead of assuming it. The rare feeling of being seen without being measured. And in those hours she made a decision again and again, recommitting herself to duty, reminding herself that survival was not cowardice, that restraint was not weakness, and that love, however powerful, could not be allowed to rewrite the rules of a world that punished disobedience without mercy. She told herself that choosing duty was an act of strength, that protecting the fragile balance of her existence was more important than indulging a feeling that could only end in ruin. And slowly, deliberately, she began to bury her heart beneath layers of composure so deep that even she sometimes forgot what lay beneath. When the moment finally came, the moment when love demanded acknowledgement, when his eyes searched hers for confirmation of what he already suspected, she did not hesitate outwardly, though inside something fractured beyond repair, and with a calm that belied the storm within, she chose duty, chose silence, chose the path that ensured survival at the cost of happiness, and in doing so she set in motion a chain of consequences she could not yet imagine, because fate, as she would learn much later, does not forget the choices made in fear, and it does not abandon stories simply because someone tries to end them early. The choice, once made, did not announce itself with drama or finality. It settled into her life the way dust settles after something heavy has fallen. Quietly, invisibly at first, then everywhere, coating her thoughts, her movements, her sense of self, because choosing duty over love did not end the feeling, it only denied it expression. And in the days that followed, she discovered that restraint required more strength than desire ever had. She moved through her routines with the same measured precision she had always practiced. But now each task carried an added weight, every familiar motion reminding her of what she had deliberately set aside, and she learned quickly that the world would not pause to acknowledge her sacrifice, that obedience was expected, not rewarded, and that no one would ever know the cost of her decision unless she herself chose to reveal it, which she would not, because revealing it would defeat the very purpose of the choice. He did not confront her directly, not at first, perhaps because he sensed that something fragile had been sealed shut, something that could not be reopened without consequence. And yet his presence became harder to endure precisely because it remained unchanged, his manner still respectful, his voice still careful, his gaze still searching in moments when he thought she would not notice. And each time their paths crossed, she felt the strain of maintaining the lie she had constructed, that there had been nothing between them. At whatever he had sensed was imagined, that her distance was simply discipline, not denial. She told herself that this was the cleanest ending possible, that ambiguity was safer than truth, and that allowing him to believe she had never cared would spare him from danger. But even as she repeated this justification, she felt the slow erosion of something essential within her, because lies told for protection still wound the one who tells them. As days turned into weeks, the world seemed determined to test her resolve, placing him in her path with cruel frequency, arranging circumstances where cooperation was unavoidable and silence stretched thin. And in those moments, she felt the sharp contrast between what she allowed herself to be and what she might have been. Imagining briefly a version of herself who could answer honestly, who could meet his gaze without calculating risk, who could choose connection without fear, and each time that imagined self appeared, she forced it back into darkness, reminding herself that fantasies had no place in survival. She became stricter with herself, limiting even internal indulgence, training her thoughts the way one trains the body to endure pain. Acknowledge it, breathe through it, do not react. And over time this discipline hardened into something that resembled peace from the outside, though inside it was closer to numbness, a carefully maintained stillness that prevented both joy and despair from breaking through. Others noticed her composure and praised it, interpreting her emotional restraint as maturity or strength, unaware that it was born from loss, and she accepted their praise without reaction, knowing that to correct them would require admitting a truth that could not be spoken aloud. He, however, seemed to change in ways that unsettled her more deeply than any accusation might have. The lightness she had once glimpsed in him dimmed, replaced by a quiet seriousness, a watchfulness that suggested he too had made a choice of his own, to accept her silence as final, to retreat into himself rather than risk further rejection. And seeing this, she questioned herself in the privacy of her thoughts, wondering whether she had miscalculated, whether the harm she had hoped to prevent had merely taken a different form. But each time doubt surfaced, she crushed it beneath the same reasoning that had guided her from the beginning, that love without freedom was not salvation but another kind of captivity, and that to pursue it would have been selfish, no matter how much it hurt to let it go. Still, the heart does not accept logic as easily as the mind does, and there were nights when sleep refused to come, when memory replayed their shared moments with merciless clarity, not as longing but as interrogation, asking again and again whether duty truly demanded such total self-denial, whether there might have been another path she had refused to see. And on those nights she lay awake, staring into darkness, listening to the sounds of a world that continued without regard for her inner conflict, and felt the loneliness of someone who has chosen survival at the cost of being known. She did not cry openly, did not allow herself the release of grief, because grief required acknowledgement, and acknowledgement risked weakening her resolve, so instead she internalized the pain, carrying it like a quiet ache that flared unexpectedly at the smallest provocation. A familiar phrase, a shared memory overheard, the sound of his laughter drifting from somewhere she could not see, and each flare reminded her that the choice she had made was not a single moment but an ongoing act, one that required constant renewal. Over time, she noticed something else changing within her, something she had not anticipated. The discipline that had once been purely defensive began to shape her identity, turning restraint into habit and habit into character, and she wondered, with a kind of distant alarm, whether she was losing the ability to feel deeply at all, whether the part of her capable of love was slowly being sealed away beyond retrieval, and this frightened her more than any punishment ever had, because it suggested that duty, when chosen too often over the heart, could erase the very capacity for connection that made survival meaningful. Yet even this fear did not move her to reverse her decision, because by now the consequences of change felt greater than the consequences of endurance, and she had built her life around the assumption that sacrifice, once made, must be honored fully to have any worth. So she continued, day after day, performing her role with quiet excellence, becoming indispensable in ways that required no vulnerability, mastering the art of being present without being exposed, and in doing so she ensured her safety, her stability, and her reputation, but not her peace. Love, though denied, did not disappear. It simply transformed, becoming a silent companion rather than an expressed desire, something she carried without acknowledging, something that shaped her choices even as she pretended it no longer existed. And as the years stretched ahead of her, unmarked by confession or closure, she believed, truly believed, that this was the end of that story, that love, once sacrificed to duty, was not meant to return, unaware that fate does not measure worth by intention alone, and that choices made in silence can echo longer than those spoken aloud. Time did what it always does to unspoken things. It stretched them, thinned them, and made them settle deep into places where they could not easily be reached. And as the years passed, her choice hardened into routine, routine into reputation, and reputation into a kind of armor that protected her from scrutiny, while slowly isolating her from herself, because obedience, when practiced long enough, stops feeling like an action and begins to feel like identity. She became known for her reliability, for the quiet precision with which she fulfilled every expectation placed upon her, and those who observed her saw only discipline and calm, never the careful calculations behind each movement or the emotional restraint that governed her every interaction. She learned exactly how much of herself to reveal and when to withdraw, mastering the art of appearing present while remaining internally distant, and this skill earned her trust, safety, and a measure of respect. But it also demanded a constant suppression of impulse that left her perpetually tired. in ways sleep could not cure. The world around her changed in small, relentless increments. Faces aged, routines shifted, seasons passed without ceremony, and through it all she remained steady, dependable, unremarkable in the way that ensured she would be left undisturbed. And this was precisely what she had aimed for when she chose duty, because invisibility was a form of protection, and protection was survival. Yet beneath that surface stability, regret moved quietly, not as sharp pain but as a dull, persistent presence, like a weight she had learned to carry so long that she no longer remembered what it felt like to walk without it. She did not allow herself to dwell on what might have been, because imagination was dangerous territory, but memory was less easily controlled, and it surfaced unexpectedly, in gestures that reminded her of him, in turns of phrase that echoed his voice, in moments of quiet when her guard slipped just enough for the past to intrude, when she wondered whether her restraint had cost her not just love but the ability to be fully human, because emotions, once denied expression long enough, do not remain contained so much as they slowly fade into something less vivid, less urgent, and she feared that if love returned to her now, she might not recognize it in time. Her interactions with him became increasingly rare as paths diverged and circumstances shifted, and when they did cross, it was with a distance so carefully maintained that even she began to believe the lie she had constructed, that what they had shared had been fleeting, inconsequential, easily left behind. And this self-deception was both comforting and devastating, because it allowed her to function without constant pain, while also erasing a part of her history she had once held sacred. He too seemed changed by time, carrying himself with a restraint that mirrored her own, and though she told herself this was proof that her choice had been the right one, that he had moved on, that her sacrifice had spared him greater harm, the sight of him no longer seeking her presence, no longer waiting for shared moments, brought with it a quiet ache she had no words for, because it suggested that what she had protected him from might not have been danger alone, but also the possibility of something meaningful. As years accumulated, her obedience deepened into expertise, and she became adept at navigating the complexities of her environment with an efficiency that left little room for error, and this competence earned her a measure of autonomy that others lacked. Yet even this small expansion of control felt hollow, because it was built upon the very discipline that had required her to abandon love, and she began to understand, with a clarity that came only through long endurance, that duty, when elevated above all else, does not simply guide behavior, it reshapes desire, narrowing the scope of what one allows oneself to want. There were nights when she lay awake, listening to the steady rhythm of her own breathing, and wondered whether regret was simply the price of survival, whether everyone who endured did so by sacrificing something essential and learning to live with the absence, and in those moments she felt both ancient and very young, as though the choice she had made had aged her beyond her years while freezing her emotional growth at the moment she turned away from love. She did not resent the world for this outcome, because resentment required the belief that things could have been otherwise, and she had trained herself not to indulge such beliefs, instead accepting her life as the logical result of circumstances and decisions, and this acceptance was perhaps the most insidious consequence of her obedience, because it left no room for anger, no catalyst for change, only a quiet resignation that settled deeper with each passing year. And yet, beneath that resignation, something remained unresolved, a faint awareness that the story she believed she had ended was not entirely finished, that the choice she had made, though necessary at the time, had not extinguished the forces set in motion by love, and while she would never have admitted it aloud, she sensed, in the most private corners of her mind, that fate had not forgotten her, that the years of obedience and regret were not merely an ending but a long, silent preparation for something she could not yet see, something that would test the meaning of her sacrifice and ask whether duty, chosen once, must be chosen forever. It happened without ceremony, without warning, without any of the dramatic signals she might have imagined during the long years she had spent convincing herself that the past was sealed, because fate rarely announces itself when it returns, and when she heard his name spoken aloud after so many years, It was not during a moment of emotional vulnerability or private reflection, but in the middle of an ordinary day, delivered casually, someone who had no idea of its weight, and the effect was immediate and uncontrollable, her body reacting before her mind could catch up, breath catching, hands stilling, a sharp heat rising behind her eyes, as if a door she had kept locked through discipline alone had suddenly been forced open. The name echoed in her head long after the voice that spoke it moved on, repeating itself with a persistence that mocked the years she had spent burying it, and for a moment the world around her seemed to tilt, familiar sounds fading into a distant hum as memory surged forward with startling clarity, not softened by time as she had expected, but preserved in sharp detail, the tone of his voice, the shape of his silence, the unspoken understanding that had once existed between them, all returning at once, as if the years of obedience and restraint had merely been a pause, rather than an erasure. She told herself to breathe, to steady her thoughts, to remember who she had become, because she was no longer the woman who had once stood at a crossroads between love and duty. She was someone shaped by endurance, by routine, by survival, and yet the past did not respect these distinctions, pressing itself against her present with an insistence that made denial impossible. She learned, in fragments at first, that he was not just alive but closer than she had ever imagined, that circumstances had shifted in ways neither of them could have predicted, and each new piece of information landed like a quiet blow, not because it promised reunion, but because it dismantled the careful narrative she had constructed to justify her choice, the story in which letting him go had been final, necessary, and ultimately merciful. The knowledge unsettled her more deeply than she expected, because it forced her to confront a truth she had long avoided, that part of her had relied on distance and uncertainty to keep the past contained, and now that distance was gone, replaced by the undeniable reality of his continued existence in a world she still occupied. She did not seek him out, not at first, because instinct and discipline warned her that doing so would reopen wounds she had spent years learning to live with, but avoidance proved impossible in an environment where paths crossed without permission, and each near encounter carried a tension that left her both braced and unprepared, heart racing with the fear of recognition and the fear of indifference in equal measure. When she finally saw him again, it was not as she had imagined during the countless nights she had replayed their last moments, not dramatic or intimate, but distant and startling in its ordinariness, his presence suddenly real rather than remembered, altered by time yet unmistakable, and the sight of him struck her with a force she could not disguise, because memory had preserved him as he was, while reality presented him as he had become, carrying the marks of years she had not shared, and this realization cut deeper than longing ever had, because it reminded her that time had continued for him as well, shaping him beyond the reach of her sacrifice. Their eyes met briefly, and in that instant she knew that he recognized her, that the past she had tried to bury was not hers alone, and the awareness settled between them like a held breath, neither of them moving, neither speaking, both acutely conscious of the weight of everything unsaid. She lowered her gaze first, not out of submission but out of habit, the reflex of a life spent choosing caution over impulse, and in doing so she felt the familiar conflict resurface, the pull between what she had trained herself to be and what she had once allowed herself to feel. The days that followed were marked by a heightened awareness that bordered on vigilance, every shared space charged with the possibility of encounter, every ordinary interaction tinged with the knowledge that the past was no longer safely behind her, but walking the same ground. And she found herself revisiting old justifications with a scrutiny she had previously avoided, asking whether the reasons she had clung to for so long still held the same weight now that circumstances had changed, and this questioning unsettled her deeply, because doubt threatened the foundation of her identity, the belief that duty, once chosen, must be upheld without exception to retain its meaning. She observed him from a distance when she could not avoid it, noting the ways he had changed and the ways he had not, the quiet confidence that had replaced youthful uncertainty, the restraint in his manner that mirrored her own, and she wondered, with a mix of guilt and curiosity, how much of that restraint had been shaped by their shared past, how much of who he had become was connected to the choice she had made years ago. At the same time, she became acutely aware of herself through his presence, noticing the habits she had formed, the emotional economy she practiced, the way she measured every response, and she questioned whether these were marks of strength or scars of a life lived in constant self-denial. She did not allow herself to imagine what reunion might mean, because imagining invited expectation, and expectation was dangerous. But even without conscious intent, her thoughts began to drift toward possibility, not of escape or romance, but of acknowledgement, of truth spoken aloud after so many years of silence, and this possibility frightened her more than longing ever had, because truth had the power to unravel the careful balance she had maintained, to expose the emotional cost of her obedience in ways she might not be able to contain. As days turned into weeks, the tension between past and present became a constant undercurrent in her life, shaping her movements, sharpening her awareness, and she realized with a quiet sense of inevitability that fate had not brought his name back into her world by accident, that the years of silence and endurance were not meant to remain unchallenged, and that the choice she had made long ago was about to be tested not by desire alone, but by the truth she had never allowed herself to voice. When their reunion finally came, it did not arrive dressed in romance or softened by nostalgia, but as something abrupt and unsettling, a collision rather than an embrace, because fate did not ask whether either of them was ready, only whether the silence could be sustained any longer, and when circumstance forced them into the same space with no buffer of distance or distraction, the years between them seemed to collapse all at once, leaving behind not comfort but exposure. There were others present at first, voices and movement filling the air, yet she felt strangely isolated, acutely aware of him in a way that made everything else recede into background noise, her senses sharpening as if preparing for impact, and when their eyes met again, fully this time, there was no mistaking the recognition that passed between them, not relief, not joy, but a shared understanding that whatever had been deferred was now unavoidable. He did not smile, and neither did she. The expressions they wore were shaped by restraint rather than warmth, by years of self-control that neither knew how to relinquish. And in that restraint lay the true devastation of their reunion, because it revealed how thoroughly time and circumstance had disciplined them both. She noticed the hesitation in his posture, the careful distance he maintained, and understood that he too was navigating the space between memory and reality, uncertain of what rights, if any, the past still granted him. And this awareness stirred something in her chest that was neither regret nor longing but a heavy recognition of shared loss. Words, when they finally came, were few and deliberate, stripped of familiarity, each syllable measured as though they were strangers bound by formal necessity rather than people with a history too dense to articulate. And formality hurt more than anger ever could, because it confirmed that the intimacy they once shared had not merely been hidden but fundamentally altered, reshaped by years of absence into something fragile and uncertain. She felt the urge to fill the silence, to explain, to apologize, to reclaim something that had been left unresolved. But discipline intervened as it always had, reminding her that explanation invited consequence, and that some truths, once spoken, could not be controlled, and so she held her composure, responding only when necessary, keeping her voice steady even as her thoughts raced. He watched her closely, not with accusation but with a kind of searching attentiveness that suggested he was looking for traces of the person he once knew, and she wondered what he saw, whether he recognized the layers she had built, the restraint that had replaced openness, or whether he sensed the conflict still living beneath her calm exterior. As their interactions continued under the watchful presence of others, she became acutely aware of how much effort it took to maintain the boundaries she had once enforced instinctively, because now the stakes felt different, not higher but more personal, and every restrained glance, every neutral response carried with it the knowledge that the truth was present, hovering just beneath the surface, waiting for a moment of weakness to emerge. He did not press her, and this restraint was perhaps the most painful aspect of their reunion, because it suggested respect rather than indifference, an understanding that whatever had separated them had not been trivial, and this understanding stripped her of the defenses she had built around the idea that he had simply moved on, that her absence had faded into insignificance over time. Instead, she saw in him the marks of endurance similar to her own, a quiet seriousness that mirrored her restraint, and she wondered whether the years had shaped them in parallel, each learning to live without what they had once hoped for, each adapting to a reality defined by limits rather than choice. Moments of unintended closeness followed, passing exchanges, shared tasks, unavoidable proximity, and each one carried a tension that left her both braced and exhausted, because proximity without permission reopened emotional pathways she had sealed through years of discipline, and she felt the familiar ache return, not as longing for what might be, but as grief for what had already been lost. She caught herself observing him too closely, noting the subtle ways he avoided certain topics, the careful neutrality of his tone, and she recognized in these habits a reflection of her own strategies, and this recognition unsettled her, because it suggested that her choice had not isolated her suffering as she had once believed, that the cost of silence had been shared, whether she intended it or not. There were moments when their eyes met unexpectedly, when neither could look away quickly enough to prevent the exchange of unspoken questions, and in those moments she felt the weight of everything she had never said press against her resolve, demanding acknowledgement, and it took every ounce of her training to remain composed, to remind herself that the reasons for her choice had not vanished simply because time had passed. Yet even as she clung to this reasoning, doubt crept in, not questioning the necessity of her past decision, but its permanence, asking whether duty, once fulfilled, must continue to demand the same sacrifice forever, and this question frightened her more than longing ever had, because it implied the possibility of change, and change threatened the fragile equilibrium she had constructed around her identity. The reunion, such as it was, did not resolve anything. It exposed, unsettled, and destabilized, leaving both of them suspended between what had been and what could never be reclaimed. And as days turned into weeks, she realized that fate had not reunited them to offer comfort or closure, but to force a reckoning with truths long deferred, truths that could no longer be ignored without consequence. She felt the pressure of this reckoning building quietly, in the spaces between words, in the tension of shared silence, and she understood with a clarity that left her breathless that the discipline which had sustained her for so long might no longer be sufficient, that duty, while still present, was about to be tested by something it could not simply suppress, and that the reunion she had never sought was not an ending but a threshold, leading toward a confrontation with truth that would demand more courage than silence ever had. The reckoning she had sensed did not arrive all at once, but gathered slowly, like pressure building beneath still water, and with each passing day the effort required to maintain silence became heavier than the fear that had once enforced it, because truth, when denied long enough, does not disappear. It waits, patient and insistent, until the cost of withholding it outweighs the danger of release, and she felt that balance shifting within her. The discipline that had sustained her now strained by the weight of everything left unsaid. It was not a single moment that broke her resolve, but an accumulation of small, relentless tensions. The way his presence altered the air in a room, the careful distance he maintained that spoke of respect rather than detachment, the unspoken questions in his eyes that mirrored those she carried within herself, and she realized that silence, once her shield, had become a barrier preventing both of them from understanding what had truly been lost. She began to recognize the subtle ways her restraint affected him, how uncertainty lingered in his posture, how he hesitated before speaking, as if measuring the risk of reopening wounds he could not see but instinctively felt, and this awareness unsettled her deeply, because it revealed that her choice, intended to protect, had also imposed a quiet burden on him, one he had carried without explanation or closure. The realization eroded the certainty she had relied on for years, forcing her to confront a truth she had long avoided, that duty, when chosen without acknowledgement of its cost, can transform into a kind of injustice, not imposed by others but sustained through self-denial, and she began to question whether her silence had preserved order or merely prolonged suffering under a different guise. The moment she finally spoke did not come in anger or desperation, but in a rare instance of stillness, when circumstance stripped away the distractions that allowed avoidance, and they found themselves alone, the absence of witnesses both a relief and a terror, because without an audience there were no roles to perform, no expectations to hide behind, only the truth that had been pressing against her for years. She felt the familiar instinct to retreat, to preserve composure at all costs. But something within her resisted this time, a quiet resolve born not of impulse but of exhaustion. And she understood that continuing in silence would require more strength than she had left, that endurance, once a virtue, had become a kind of erasure she could no longer justify. When she began to speak, her voice was steady, not because she was unafraid, but because fear had lost its authority over her, and she told him not what she thought he wanted to hear, but what she had never allowed herself to say aloud, that the choice she made years ago had not been born of indifference or rejection, but of calculation, of a desperate attempt to protect what little stability existed in a world that punished deviation without mercy. She explained the constraints she had lived under, the responsibilities that had shaped her decisions, the awareness that love, however genuine, would not have freed them but bound them more tightly to consequences neither could escape, and as she spoke, she felt something loosen in her, the tension of years releasing not as relief but as clarity. She did not ask for forgiveness, because forgiveness implied wrongdoing, and she did not frame her choice as noble, because nobility offered no comfort. Instead, she presented it as it had been, necessary, painful, and incomplete, a decision made with limited options that had demanded sacrifice without guaranteeing safety. He listened without interruption, his silence attentive rather than withdrawn, and in that silence she sensed not judgment but grief, the kind that emerges when understanding arrives too late to alter the past, and this grief resonated with her own, because it confirmed what she had suspected but never acknowledged, that the cost of her duty had not been hers alone to bear. When he finally spoke, his words were measured, shaped by the same restraint she recognized in herself, and he did not accuse her of cruelty or cowardice, but asked the question that had haunted them both, whether there had ever been a moment when she believed another choice was possible, and she answered honestly, admitting that there had been moments of doubt, moments when she had wondered whether endurance was simply fear disguised as responsibility, and in admitting this she felt both exposed and strangely grounded, because truth, once spoken, has a way of anchoring the self rather than unraveling it. Their conversation did not resolve the years between them, it clarified them, replacing speculation with understanding, and this understanding altered the nature of their connection, shifting it from unresolved tension to something quieter and more complex, built not on longing but on recognition of shared constraint. She realized then that love, when denied expression, does not vanish but transforms, becoming something that informs choices long after desire has been suppressed, and she saw in his eyes that he recognized this transformation as well, that whatever they had once been to each other had not been erased but reshaped by time and circumstance into a bond that resisted simple definition. Speaking the truth did not free her from duty, nor did it restore what had been lost, but it changed the terms of her endurance, allowing her to carry the past without denying it, and this shift felt both unsettling and necessary, because it required her to accept that survival alone was not enough, that understanding, even without resolution, was a form of dignity she had denied herself for too long. In the days that followed, she noticed a subtle change in herself, a loosening of the rigid control she had maintained, not enough to invite recklessness, but enough to allow feeling without immediate suppression, and she understood that this was not a betrayal of duty but an evolution of it, a recognition that obligation need not demand the erasure of the self to remain valid. Their interactions, though still restrained, carried a different weight now, informed by shared truth rather than mutual guessing, and while the future remained uncertain, she felt a quiet sense of steadiness she had not known before, the steadiness that comes from no longer hiding the reason behind one's choices. She did not know what fate intended by reuniting them after so many years, nor did she presume that acknowledgement would lead to reunion in any conventional sense, but she understood that the act of speaking had altered the trajectory of her life in subtle but irreversible ways, because once truth is named, it cannot be returned to silence without cost. Duty remained a constant presence, shaping her actions and responsibilities, but it no longer stood alone as the defining principle of her existence. It now shared space with understanding, with the recognition that love, even when sacrificed, leaves an imprint that time cannot erase, and as she moved forward into an uncertain future, she carried with her the knowledge that endurance, when informed by truth, becomes something more than survival. It becomes a testament to the complexity of choice in a world that rarely offers simple answers. After truth had finally been spoken and the long-held silence relinquished its grip, the world did not soften around them as one might expect, nor did it reward honesty with immediate clarity, because fate's final tests are rarely generous, and instead it introduced a new, more demanding uncertainty, one that asked not what they felt, but what they would do now that feeling could no longer be denied. The days that followed were marked by a careful recalibration of presence, each of them learning how to exist in the same spaces without retreating into old defenses or overreaching toward promises neither could guarantee. And in this recalibration, she felt the weight of responsibility settle anew, heavier now because it carried knowledge rather than ignorance. Duty, which had once been her refuge, now stood before her as a question rather than a command, and she understood that the real test was not whether she could endure in silence, but whether she could choose integrity without unraveling the fragile stability she had spent years constructing. Circumstances tightened around them in subtle ways, expectations shifting, watchful eyes returning, the environment reminding her that while truth might be acknowledged in private, it was not always permitted in action, and she sensed that fate was narrowing the field, stripping away the comfort of indecision until only a single, difficult choice remained. He, too, felt the pressure, though he spoke of it rarely, and she noticed how his restraint deepened not from resignation but from care, from an understanding that whatever steps they took would have consequences beyond themselves, consequences she had always been acutely aware of, and he was only now beginning to fully grasp. There were moments when possibility hovered close enough to touch, shared silences that felt less guarded, exchanges that carried warmth rather than tension, and in those moments she felt the pull of a future that did not require erasure, a future where acknowledgement itself was a form of resistance. But each time she allowed herself to consider it, reality asserted itself with unflinching clarity, reminding her of the structures that had not changed simply because they had spoken the truth. Fate's test, she realized, was not asking her to abandon duty for love as it once had, but to redefine duty in a way that did not demand the destruction of her inner life, and this redefinition was far more challenging than the binary choice she had faced years ago, because it required balance rather than sacrifice, discernment rather than denial. She found herself revisiting old assumptions, questioning whether obedience had always been synonymous with virtue, whether survival truly required emotional withdrawal, and these questions unsettled her, not because they threatened her sense of safety, but because they invited growth, and growth carried risks she had spent a lifetime avoiding. The world around them seemed indifferent to these internal reckonings, continuing its routines, enforcing its hierarchies. And in that indifference, she recognized the final cruelty of fate's design, that the most meaningful transformations often occur without witness, without validation, and without guarantee of reward. When the decisive moment arrived, it did so quietly, without spectacle, presenting itself as a choice framed in practical terms, one that could be justified easily by the logic she had long relied upon, and she understood immediately what accepting it would mean. Not just continued stability, but a return to the emotional containment she had just begun to loosen, a reaffirmation of the old pattern in which duty reigned unchallenged. Declining it, on the other hand, would not grant freedom or reunion in any conventional sense. It would merely assert her right to act with honesty, to refuse a path that demanded the suppression of self as its prick. And this was the essence of fate's final test, not whether she would choose love, but whether she would choose herself without destroying the responsibilities she still carried. She weighed the options with the same care she had always applied to survival, but now her calculations included factors she had once dismissed as irrelevant: emotional integrity, mutual understanding, the quiet dignity of living without contradiction, and in considering these, she felt the years of obedience and regret converge into a single clarifying awareness that endurance alone was not the measure of a life well lived. He did not urge her in either direction, and this restraint was its own form of support, acknowledging her agency without attempting to claim it. And in that acknowledgement she felt a depth of respect that transcended the longing they had once shared, because it recognized her not as a symbol of sacrifice or desire, but as a person capable of complex choice. When she made her decision, it was not accompanied by relief or triumph, but by a quiet steadiness, the kind that settles when action aligns with truth. And though the outcome did not alter the external structures of her world, it transformed her relationship to them, allowing her to inhabit her responsibilities without self-erasure. Fate's test did not grant them an ending that could be easily named or celebrated. Instead, it offered something subtler, and perhaps more enduring, a shared understanding that love, when tempered by reality and informed by truth, does not always seek possession or escape, but sometimes chooses presence, honesty, and restraint as its highest expressions. As she moved forward, carrying the weight of her decision with a clarity she had never known before, she understood that fate had not reunited them to undo the past or to reward suffering, but to ask whether the person she had become could live without denying the woman she once was. And in answering that question, she discovered a strength deeper than obedience and a courage quieter than rebellion, one that allowed her to stand within the world as it was while refusing to surrender the truth of who she had become. What remained after fate's final test was not emptiness, as she had once feared it would be, nor was it fulfillment in the simple romantic sense that stories often promise, but something far more complex and quietly enduring, a landscape reshaped by choice, where loss and meaning coexisted without cancelling one another, and where the absence of certainty no longer felt like a punishment, but like a condition of being alive. In the days that followed her decision, she moved through the world with a new awareness, sensing how every familiar space now carried an altered resonance, as though the walls themselves remembered the silence she had broken and the truth she had refused to bury again. And this awareness did not make life easier, but it made it honest, which was a form of strength she had never fully allowed herself to claim. She noticed how the rhythm of her responsibilities remained unchanged. Tasks still demanded attention, obligations still pressed forward with the same unyielding logic, but her relationship to them had shifted, no longer rooted in fear or resignation, but in conscious participation, and this distinction mattered more than any external change, because it meant she was no longer surviving on borrowed justifications or inherited rules alone. He was still present, though differently now, no longer as a question hovering at the edge of her restraint, but as a steady, respectful reality, someone who understood the boundaries she had drawn, not as rejection, but as the shape of her integrity, and in this understanding there was a tenderness deeper than longing, a recognition that what they shared could not be measured by proximity or possession. There were moments when memory surged unexpectedly, recalling the intensity of what had once been forbidden and the ache of what had nearly been lost. And in those moments she allowed herself to feel the sadness fully, without rushing to contain it or translate it into endurance, because she had learned that grief unacknowledged has a way of hardening into silence, and silence was no longer a refuge she was willing to inhabit. As time passed, the world seemed to test the permanence of her resolve, offering subtle invitations to revert to old patterns, to accept familiar forms of validation that required only quiet compliance, and each time she recognized these invitations for what they were, not overt threats but gentle erasures, and declined them with a calm that surprised even herself. What remained, she realized, was the quiet labor of maintaining alignment between inner truth and outer action, a labor that did not announce itself as heroic and rarely received recognition, but which demanded vigilance, humility, and an ongoing willingness to confront discomfort without retreating into self-denial. She found that freedom, contrary to her earlier beliefs, was not the absence of constraint, but the presence of choice within constraint. the ability to act with intention even when circumstances remained imperfect, and this understanding reframed the story she told herself about her life, transforming it from one of mere endurance into one of deliberate becoming. He too carried what remained, though in his own way, and she sensed that the restraint he practiced was not a loss, but a form of devotion to the truth they now shared. A recognition that love does not always culminate in union, but sometimes in the mutual protection of each other's wholeness. Their conversations, when they occurred, were marked by a depth that did not require elaboration, each word weighted with awareness, each silence chosen rather than imposed, and in this careful exchange she felt a sense of equality that had once seemed impossible, because it rested not on secrecy or defiance, but on respect. Over time, she began to notice how her internal landscape continued to evolve, how the sharp edges of regret softened into reflection, and how the certainty she had once sought gave way to a more flexible resilience, one that allowed her to adapt without abandoning herself. And this evolution did not erase the past, but integrated it, granting it a place that neither dominated nor disappeared. What remained, above all, was the understanding that fate had not been an external force acting upon her alone, but a dialogue between circumstance and choice, one that unfolded over years rather than moments, and in recognizing this, she reclaimed authorship over her story without denying the constraints that shaped it. There were still nights when the weight of what might have been pressed against her chest, when imagination lingered on alternate paths and unchosen futures, but these nights no longer unraveled her, because she had learned to distinguish between mourning and longing, between honoring the past and attempting to relive it. She discovered that meaning does not require resolution in the conventional sense, that a life can be coherent without being complete, and that love, when stripped of fantasy, often reveals itself as a commitment to truth rather than a pursuit of happiness. As seasons changed and time continued its indifferent passage, she found herself offering guidance to others in quiet ways, not through grand declarations, but through the steadiness of her presence, the refusal to participate in silencing, and the courage to acknowledge complexity where simplicity would have been easier. And in doing so, she recognized how her own transformation extended beyond her personal narrative, subtly influencing the spaces she occupied. What remained after fate, then, was not a single outcome, but a continuum, a life lived with awareness, a love held without possession, and a self no longer fragmented by fear or obligation. And while this continuum lacked the clarity of an ending, it but something more sustaining, the ability to move forward without denying the truth of where she had been. In the quiet moments, when she reflected on the long path that had led her here, she no longer framed her story as one of loss narrowly escaped or desire narrowly contained, but as a testament to the strength required to live honestly within constraint, to choose integrity without spectacle, and to accept that some of the most profound victories are invisible to all but the one who carries them. And so what remained was not an echo of what she had surrendered, but a presence rooted in who she had become, a presence that allowed her to stand within the world without shrinking, to love without ownership, and to continue forward not because fate had been kind, but because she had learned how to meet it without losing herself.